What if the trait toxic people fear most isn't strength, confidence, or even confrontation, but someone who quietly refuses to be controlled? Most people assume toxic individuals are intimidated by powerful personalities or loud boundaries. In reality, that's rarely what unsettles them. What truly disrupts their entire strategy is far more subtle, and it's something many empaths possess without fully realizing it. Here's the strange part. Toxic people often seem drawn to empaths in the beginning. They shower them with attention, create an instant sense of connection, and make them feel deeply understood. But over time, that attraction quietly transforms into frustration, manipulation, and eventually fear. Why? Because beneath all the emotional games, toxic people rely on one psychological need above everything else: predictable emotional access. The moment that access disappears, their confidence starts to crack. Have you ever noticed how someone's behavior completely changes when they realize they can no longer influence your emotions? They become unusually persistent, strangely emotional, or sometimes unexpectedly kind. Almost nobody realizes these reactions aren't random. They're signals that their usual psychological strategies have stopped working. By the end of this video, you'll understand the one thing toxic people fear most about empaths, why this fear shapes nearly everything they do, and how recognizing these hidden patterns can completely change the way you view difficult relationships. Once you see the psychology behind it, you'll never interpret manipulative behavior the same way again. The biggest misunderstanding about empaths is that they are simply nice people. That label barely scratches the surface. An empath's greatest strength isn't kindness, it's the ability to recognize emotional patterns long before other people do. They notice subtle changes in tone, facial expressions, body language, and energy that most people overlook. Ironically, this quiet awareness is exactly what makes them both attractive and threatening to toxic individuals. At first, a toxic person often sees an empath as the perfect target. Someone compassionate is more likely to give second chances, explain away hurtful behavior, and believe people can change. This creates an opportunity for manipulation. The toxic person learns which emotional buttons produce guilt, sympathy, or self-doubt, and they begin pressing those buttons repeatedly. But here's where the psychology shifts. Empaths are constantly collecting emotional information, even when they don't realize it. Every broken promise, every contradiction, every passive-aggressive comment, and every fake apology gets stored in their mind like pieces of a puzzle. They may stay quiet for weeks or even months, leading others to believe nothing is wrong. In reality, they're observing. They're comparing actions to words. They're looking for consistency rather than excuses. Have you ever noticed someone who rarely argues suddenly becomes completely certain about a decision? That certainty didn't appear overnight. It was built through hundreds of small observations that finally connected into one clear picture. Imagine a friend who always has an explanation for disappointing you. They're late because work was stressful. They forgot your birthday because life has been overwhelming. They dismiss your feelings because they're just being honest. Individually, each excuse sounds believable. But eventually, the empath notices the common denominator isn't bad luck. It's a consistent lack of respect. Once that realization settles in, the emotional spell begins to break. This is the one moment toxic people almost never anticipate. They assume emotional patience means emotional blindness. They mistake silence for weakness and forgiveness for unlimited tolerance. In reality, the empath has been gathering evidence the entire time. Body language often reveals this turning point before words do. The empath stops seeking reassurance. Eye contact becomes calm instead of anxious. Their posture relaxes because they're no longer trying to earn approval. Conversations become shorter, more direct, and emotionally neutral. To an outside observer, these changes seem small, To a toxic person who depends on emotional influence, they're impossible to ignore. What they're witnessing is something they fear more than confrontation: the loss of emotional control. And once that control begins to disappear, toxic behavior often becomes more intense rather than less. Instead of accepting the change, they frequently double down on manipulation, testing whether their old tactics still work. That's where the next psychological pattern becomes impossible to ignore. Once an empath begins seeing the relationship clearly, something remarkable starts to happen. They stop reacting the way they used to. This isn't because they've become cold or uncaring. It's because they've learned a psychological truth that changes everything. Not every emotion deserves a response. For a toxic person, this shift is deeply unsettling. Their influence has always depended on creating emotional reactions, whether it's guilt, confusion, fear, or the desperate need to explain yourself. Every strong reaction reassures them that they still have access to your emotional world. As long as they can predict your response, they feel in control. But here's what most people completely miss. The moment an empath becomes emotionally independent, that predictability disappears. Suddenly, the toxic person's usual strategies stop producing the same results. The criticism that once triggered self-doubt is met with calm silence. The guilt trip that once led to endless apologies is answered with a simple boundary. The emotional roller coaster they've carefully maintained begins to lose momentum. This isn't about winning an argument. It's about changing the emotional dynamic. Have you ever noticed how some people become more dramatic precisely when you become calmer? It seems backwards, but psychologically it makes perfect sense. When someone can no longer control your emotions, they often increase the intensity of their behavior in an attempt to recreate the old pattern. They may accuse you of changing, claim you've become selfish, or insist that you don't care anymore. These statements often reveal less about you than they do about their growing sense of lost control. Consider a familiar situation. Imagine an employee who always stays late because their manager pressures them with subtle guilt. For years, they feel responsible for everyone else's expectations. Then one day, they politely say, "I can't stay tonight. I'll continue tomorrow during work hours." No anger, no lengthy explanation, just a respectful boundary. Instead of appreciating the honesty, the manager becomes irritated, questioning their commitment or suggesting they've lost their work ethic. The issue isn't really the schedule, it's the disappearance of emotional leverage. The same pattern appears in friendships, families, and romantic relationships. Emotional independence forces unhealthy dynamics into the open because manipulation becomes much harder when the other person no longer feels obligated to justify every decision. Baby language also reflects this transformation. The empath stops nervously over-explaining. Their breathing stays steady during uncomfortable conversations. Their voice becomes slower, quieter, and more deliberate. They aren't trying to dominate the interaction. They simply aren't surrendering their emotional stability anymore. This changes the entire relationship. The toxic person realizes the old emotional shortcuts no longer work, and that realization often creates frustration, desperation, or even panic. They begin searching for new ways to regain influence, sometimes becoming unexpectedly charming, other times unusually hostile. And that's where the next hidden pattern emerges. Because when manipulation stops working, toxic people often reveal who they really are. One of the clearest signs that a toxic person feels their influence fading is that their personality suddenly becomes inconsistent. The kindness that once seemed effortless disappears overnight. The patience they displayed in the beginning turns into irritation. The confidence they projected becomes insecurity disguised as anger. This isn't a random mood swing, it's a psychological response to losing control of the narrative. Here's what most people completely miss. Healthy relationships don't require someone to wear a mask. You can disagree, set boundaries, and still treat each other with respect. Toxic relationships, however, often depend on carefully managed impressions. In the early stages, a toxic person may appear exceptionally attentive, supportive, or understanding because they're building trust and emotional dependence. But once they sense that their influence is slipping, maintaining that image becomes much harder. Think about what happens when someone's usual strategy no longer works. If they relied on guilt, they may suddenly become the victim. If they relied on charm, they may switch to criticism. If they relied on intimidation, they may suddenly become unusually affectionate. The tactic changes, but the objective remains the same: to pull you back into a predictable emotional pattern. Have you ever noticed someone apologizing without actually taking responsibility? They might say, "I'm sorry you feel that way," or "I guess I can't do anything right." At first glance, it sounds like an apology, but if you listen carefully, the focus isn't on understanding your experience. It's on redirecting the conversation back to their emotions. That's a subtle but powerful psychological blind spot. Imagine a woman who has spent years supporting a close friend through every crisis. She's always available, always forgiving, always willing to listen. But after recognizing that the friendship is one sided, she begins matching effort instead of overextending herself. She still responds kindly, but she no longer drops everything whenever the friend calls. Almost immediately, the friend accuses her of becoming distant, uncaring, and not the same person anymore. In reality, the empath hasn't become less caring, they've simply stopped carrying the entire relationship alone. This is where emotional intelligence becomes incredibly important. Instead of focusing only on someone's words, start observing whether their behavior remains consistent when they don't get what they want. Anyone can appear respectful when life is going their way. Character is revealed when expectations aren't met. Body language often exposes this shift as well. Forced smiles appear and disappear quickly. Eye contact becomes more intense during attempts to pressure you. Their voice may fluctuate between unusually soft and unexpectedly harsh, depending on which approach they believe will restore their influence. These aren't guaranteed signs of manipulation on their own, but when they repeatedly accompany controlling behavior, they form a meaningful pattern. The empath's greatest advantage isn't winning these moments, it's recognizing them without becoming emotionally trapped by them. Once you understand that someone's changing behavior is often a reaction to losing influence rather than a reflection of your worth, you stop personalizing every accusation. And that realization leads to one of the biggest turning points in any relationship. Because once an empath refuses to carry someone else's emotional responsibility, the toxic person is forced to face something they've avoided for a very long time. That's where the deepest fear finally begins to surface. At the heart of most toxic relationship dynamics is a simple psychological pattern: avoiding accountability. Toxic people often spend enormous amounts of energy managing how they're perceived rather than examining how they actually behave. As long as someone else carries the blame, they never have to confront their own choices. That's why an empath who develops strong self-awareness becomes so intimidating. They stop accepting responsibility for problems they didn't create. This changes everything. Have you ever noticed how quickly a conversation can shift when you calmly ask for consistency instead of accepting excuses? Suddenly, the focus moves away from your reaction and toward their behavior. For someone who depends on deflection, that's an uncomfortable place to be. Here's what most people completely miss: accountability doesn't require arguments. It doesn't require proving someone wrong or exposing every contradiction. In fact, the quieter your confidence becomes, the harder it is for manipulation to survive. When an empath stops defending themselves against false accusations and instead observes actions over promises, the emotional game begins to collapse. Imagine a man whose partner repeatedly cancels important plans at the last minute. Every time there's a believable explanation, he spends months convincing himself that each incident is an exception. Eventually, he notices the pattern instead of the individual excuses. Rather than starting another emotional debate, he calmly says, "Reliability is important to me. If this continues, I'll need to reconsider this relationship." There's no shouting, no insults, no attempt to punish the other person, but the response is immediate. Instead of discussing the repeated cancellations, the partner accuses him of being demanding, insensitive, or impossible to please. Why? Because acknowledging the pattern would require accepting responsibility. Redirecting the conversation feels psychologically safer than confronting uncomfortable truth. This is where emotional intelligence becomes a powerful filter. Rather than asking, "Did they say the right thing?" begin asking, "Do their actions consistently match their words?" Trust isn't built through emotional speeches. It's built through repeated behavior over time. Body language often reinforces this difference. Someone who accepts accountability tends to remain open during difficult conversations. They listen before responding, maintain steady eye contact, and focus on solving the problem. Someone avoiding accountability may interrupt frequently, become unusually defensive, cross their arms, lean away, or constantly redirect attention back to your supposed flaws. Again, none of these behaviors alone prove manipulation, but together they often reveal a deeper pattern. As empaths become more aware of these patterns, something remarkable happens. They stop chasing explanations and start trusting evidence. They no longer need every question answered because consistent behavior has already provided the answer. For a toxic person, this is one of the most frightening developments imaginable. The emotional confusion they've relied upon is disappearing, replaced by quiet clarity. And when clarity replaces confusion, their ability to influence the relationship begins to fade. That's when many toxic people make one final attempt to regain control, using the one psychological weapon they hope will still keep the empath emotionally connected. Once a toxic person realizes they've lost their emotional influence, they rarely give up immediately. Instead, they often switch to a final psychological strategy, creating just enough hope to make you question your decision. This is one of the most confusing stages, because their behavior may suddenly look like the change you've been waiting for. But here's where it gets interesting. Real change is usually steady, consistent, and doesn't demand immediate forgiveness. Manipulative change, on the other hand, often appears suddenly, especially when the relationship is slipping away. Grand apologies, unexpected kindness, emotional promises, and dramatic declarations of love can all arrive at the exact moment they realize you're becoming emotionally independent. Have you ever noticed someone who ignored your feelings for months suddenly becoming the perfect partner the moment you started pulling away? At first, it feels like progress. But if the motivation is driven by fear of losing control rather than genuine self-awareness, the improvement rarely lasts. This is a common psychological blind spot. As humans, we're naturally drawn to hope. We want to believe people can grow. We remember the good moments and imagine they can become permanent. Toxic individuals often understand this instinct, whether consciously or unconsciously, and they use it to reopen emotional doors that were finally beginning to close. Imagine a woman who has spent years in a relationship where every disagreement ends with blame and emotional exhaustion. After months of reflection, she decides to leave. Almost immediately, her partner begins sending heartfelt messages, buying thoughtful gifts, making promises about therapy, and talking about a completely different future together. Friends tell her, maybe they've finally changed. But instead of focusing on the promises, she quietly asks herself a different question. What changed first? Their character or my decision to leave? That single question changes everything. If the transformation only began after consequences appeared, it's worth slowing down before assuming lasting growth has taken place. Genuine accountability isn't measured by emotional speeches during a crisis. It's measured by consistent actions long after the immediate pressure has passed. Body language often reflects this difference as well. Someone who is sincerely changing tends to appear patient and respectful, understanding that trust must be rebuilt over time. Someone trying to regain control often seems unusually intense. They may invade your personal space, seek constant reassurance, watch your reactions closely, or become frustrated when forgiveness isn't immediate. Their urgency reveals that they're focused on restoring the old dynamic rather than building a healthier one. This doesn't mean people are incapable of change. Many people do grow when they become genuinely self-aware. The difference is that authentic growth accepts boundaries, respects your pace, and doesn't pressure you into making quick emotional decisions. For the empath, the most powerful response isn't anger or revenge. It's observation. When you stop judging people by isolated emotional moments and start evaluating long-term patterns, manipulation becomes much easier to recognize. And that's exactly what toxic people fear most. Not an empath who hates them, but an empath who finally sees them clearly. Once that clarity takes root, the relationship can never return to the way it was before. That realization leads us to the final and most important lesson of this entire journey. What an empath should do after recognizing these patterns, and how self-awareness, not control, is the key to every healthy relationship. After everything we've explored, you might think the one thing toxic people fear most is an empath's kindness, resilience, or ability to walk away. But the deeper truth is even more powerful. What they fear most is an empath who has become self-aware. Self-awareness changes every relationship because it changes the questions you ask yourself. Instead of wondering, how do I make this person understand me? You begin asking, what is this relationship consistently teaching me? Instead of chasing closure, you start looking for patterns. Instead of feeling responsible for another person's emotional state, you recognize where your responsibility ends and theirs begins. That shift is life-changing. Have you ever noticed how difficult it is to manipulate someone who no longer needs constant validation? They don't panic when they're misunderstood. They don't rush to defend every accusation. They don't measure their worth by another person's approval. Their confidence isn't loud. It comes from clarity. This is what almost nobody realizes. Toxic people often expect relationships to revolve around emotional reactions. They assume that guilt will create compliance, criticism will create insecurity, or affection will erase unhealthy behavior. But when an empath develops strong self-awareness, those predictable reactions begin to disappear. They pause before responding. They observe instead of assuming. They make decisions based on repeated behavior rather than temporary emotion. Imagine a man who spent years believing every conflict was his fault. Whenever someone became upset, he immediately apologized, even when he wasn't sure what he'd done wrong. Over time, he began learning about emotional intelligence and healthy communication. He noticed that some disagreements led to understanding, while others always ended with blame, confusion, and self-doubt. The next time someone tried to pull him into the same cycle, he didn't argue. He simply listened. He asked calm questions. He refused to match emotional intensity with emotional intensity. And when the conversation became disrespectful, he ended it respectfully instead of desperately trying to fix it. For the first time, he realized something profound. Peace isn't something another person gives you. It's something you protect through healthy boundaries and clear self-awareness. Body language reflects this inner transformation in remarkable ways. The empath's movements become more relaxed. because they're no longer carrying constant emotional tension. Their eye contact becomes natural rather than approval seeking. Their posture communicates quiet confidence, not because they're trying to appear strong, but because they're no longer afraid of disappointing people who refuse to respect them. This doesn't mean they stop caring, it means they start caring wisely. Healthy empathy isn't sacrificing yourself to keep someone else comfortable. It's offering compassion without abandoning your own values. It's understanding another person's pain without making it your responsibility to solve. It's recognizing that love, trust, and respect can only grow where accountability exists. And perhaps that's the greatest lesson of all. The goal isn't to become suspicious of everyone or to label every difficult person as toxic. Human beings are imperfect. We all make mistakes, react emotionally, and carry invisible wounds. The real skill is learning to distinguish between someone who occasionally falls short and someone who consistently refuses to grow. When you develop that ability, relationships become much clearer. You stop chasing potential and start appreciating consistency. You stop confusing intensity with intimacy. You stop interpreting manipulation as love. Most importantly, you realize that your greatest strength was never your ability to endure unhealthy behavior. It was your ability to learn from it. The one thing toxic people fear most about empaths isn't kindness, silence, or even distance. It's the moment an empath understands their own worth so clearly that manipulation no longer feels familiar. Because once someone truly sees the pattern, they rarely become trapped by it again. And that's a freedom no one else can take away.